But first, the Melbourne Cup might be the race that stops the nation, and as welcome as it was to return to some sort of semi-normal today, it was really only a momentary distraction from the big challenges facing our world and our country. Last week, Prime Minister Scott Morrison took his government dangerously close to a meltdown in order to have a net zero emissions commitment at the Glasgow Climate Conference, which officially began overnight. Many Conservatives, regional Liberals and most of the National Party had to be bludgeoned into reversing a decade of opposition to Labor-like policies on climate. Well, it turns out, UK, US and Western Europe aside, the majority of countries in the world don't think climate change is the biggest challenge they face, and they aren't going to cut their emissions in ways that damage their economies or hurt their standard of living. That's why the G20 meeting on Rome on the weekend leading into Glasgow, the G20 refused to sign up to net zero by 2050, merely aiming to instead achieve net zero with these weasel words, by or around mid-century. In fact, the Morrison government's policy prior to last week's reversal turns out to be the position that most of the world has taken to Glasgow. Namely that we should get emissions down, but that we shouldn't put cutting emissions ahead of protecting jobs and boosting prosperity. That's why China hasn't moved on its pre-Glasgow aim for net zero by 2060, because for China, achieving a Western-style standard of living and becoming by far the world's biggest and strongest economy has priority. India too, which has just announced its aim, just a name, mind you, not a commitment, but a name, for net zero by 2070 or 50 years off. They've done so because they're also prioritising prosperity and jobs and power for people. It's all very well for the Queen and Prince Charles to tell us this is 1 minute to midnight. Frankly, beyond the woke suburbs of Western cities, no one's sold. Of course, people want a better, cleaner environment, but 1 or 2 degrees of global warming doesn't worry them as much as keeping the lights on and debts paid and kids educated. And hundreds of private jets, 400 at last count, tell a story, doesn't it? All these national leaders, celebrities and rent-seeking billionaires flying into Glasgow exemplify what's wrong with the climate cult. It's a whole lot of rich people telling poor people that they need to make sacrifices. And at least in countries that are still relatively poor, no government's going to sign them up for that. These developing countries aren't stupid. So they're more than happy to demand more action on climate change from the rich West, that in China's case will help it achieve the military and economic superiority it seeks. And in everyone else's case, it just means more access to conscience-easing foreign aid that's no longer just an international welfare handout, but now can be presented as necessary for the protection of the planet. $100 billion a year. $100 billion a year. That's the climate aid commitment that poorer countries are seeking from richer ones, on top of all the other foreign aid that's currently given. Just one example. Yesterday, the Australian government raised to over $100 million the money we're giving to Fiji, supposedly to develop a so-called high-integrity carbon market. This is where businesses in rich countries buy carbon credits from farmers in poor countries, supposedly to offset the carbon emissions generated by dwindling heavy industries that rich countries haven't already outsourced to poor ones. There have been any number of scams associated with carbon trading, usually involving the issuance of multiple credits for the same so-called carbon sink. Frankly, if Australia wants to help Fiji, which might well need the help to stop it falling into the Chinese sphere of influence, we'd be better off just paying farmers to improve their land use and not to clear rainforest, rather than dressing it up as climate aid. So coming out of this week's international Gabfests, so G20 and now of course Glasgow, 2 things are obvious. First, that achieving carbon neutrality anytime soon means mind-boggling expense and massive change to the way we live our lives. Net zero can only be achieved by the abandonment of coal. A chance of doing that with China building a new coal-fired power station almost every week. Net zero means demand for oil falling by 75%. Now, fat chance of that too, with electric vehicles barely 1% of global sales. Net zero also means wind and solar power going from around 5% now to almost 70% of the world's energy supplies. A chance of that without a revolution in batteries, realising the expensive pipe dream of green hydrogen, or the world going nuclear. I won't hold my breath there. But second, in the effort to do all of this, you and I will be expected to drive less, to fly less, and to eat less meat, just so that our countries can continue to hand economic leadership to the ones that don't share our emissions obsession. Yes, the UK has cut its emissions by 78% since 1990, but only by outsourcing its requirements for steel, aluminium, and much of its manufacturing to China. But for that, Britain's emissions would be at least 40% higher than Boris Johnson is crowing about tonight in Glasgow. As things stand, we get the warm inner glow on climate, while China gets our jobs and the economic muscle it needs to get rich and push America out of the Western Pacific. They say a week's a long time in politics. If only the coalition had waited a week, it would have had no fewer friends at Glasgow and would have kept a lot more of its intellectual and political credibility, so needed here at home.